command cards, right? Which, like, they're command cards. It makes sense. That's a word that means things to most people. Were originally called something ridiculous, like platoon and something, like very war gamey. Like no normal human that would ever want to play with cards called that, right? Like it's
That's hilarious. Welcome to Cardboard Creations, where we discuss the process, techniques, and inspiration for designing board games. I'm your host, Candice Harris, and I'm thrilled to be here today with David Thompson to find out how Undaunted Normandy was created. But first, let's jump into a brief overview of how Undaunted Normandy works. Undaunted Normandy is a two-player deck-building game where each player commands either US or German rifle platoons fighting through a series of missions critical to the outcome of World War II. Undaunted Normandy features 12 different scenarios which can be played completely standalone in any order, or they can be played consecutively as a campaign. Each scenario has a different landscape of tiles which you have to master in order to claim the objectives and gain advantageous positions. Regardless if you play standalone games or a campaign, each game is played over a series of rounds where players take turns playing cards to activate their unit's abilities, such as moving and scouting new territories, bolstering units to add cards from the supply to your deck, attacking opposing forces, and controlling objectives. Each scenario specifies the victory condition for each side, which involves either controlling a certain amount of objective points or pinning your opponent's forces. As soon as a player meets their victory condition, the game ends immediately and that player is the winner. Hey David, welcome to the show.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Pretty good. Yeah, I'm stoked to have you on. When I first got into the hobby, deck building was early on like one of my favorite mechanics, and it still is. And I love all the different ways that different designers incorporate deck building with all sorts of other kind of mechanics and themes. So I fell in love with Undaunted Normandy, like probably when I started reading the rule book. But yeah, I'm really curious to know, like, how did you or Trevor Benjamin, because I know this is a co-design, how did you guys initially come up with the idea for creating Undaunted Normandy?
Yeah. So just like you, deck building is a huge, part of me. It's one of my favorite mechanisms. I love deck building, pool building. And so, but the story of how, the original inspiration for Undaunted came about, it's a combination of all sorts of different things sort of coalescing at the same time. And so, it really goes back to like how I became a board gamer, right? So, I did not grow up playing board games, really. I grew up as a role-playing game guy. I grew up playing D&D. I played D&D all through, my childhood, up until I had went to college and joined the Air Force, up until really I got married and had kids. And then I just didn't have, I was always the DM. I was always creating my own material, and I just didn't have the time to dedicate to that. I was just becoming exposed to board games, right? Like, so I would walk into game stores for RPG stuff, and I would see something like Twilight Imperium. I'm like, what is that thing over there? Right? I had no idea. And so I started listening to the Secret Cabal Gaming podcast because when they first started, they had RPG material in their podcast.
Oh.
And so I was like, oh, this is an RPG podcast, but they're talking about board games. What are these board games? And when they were talking about like very Ameritrashy games, that appealed to me, right? Which I've totally transitioned into like a Euro lover, a war game lover. I don't really play Ameritrash, but at the time I was like, oh, this sounds amazing. This whatever it was at the time.
Cool.
And so that's how I got into board games. But as I was getting into board games and, I had time to do it because it was something that was self-contained. It wasn't like all the time that I was spending doing RPG design. I had been working on this game that at the time I called Skirmish Tactics Apocalypse, but you know it as For What Remains.
Yes, heck yeah.
Right? So that game was born in like the mid-2000s as this inspiration from things like Final Fantasy Tactics, the video game, Dungeons and Dragons, Blood Bowl, the original Mage Knight Clicks game, not the not the board game, but the old Clicks game, which is like, if you know Hero Clicks, the
No.
Marvel. So it's the skirmish battle game where you take the little base of a guy and you rotate it and he clicks to see how damaged he is. So
Oh,
all of
okay.
those
Okay, gotcha.
things, yeah, so all of those things were inspiring this game that I was making at the time. And that was before I even knew that board games existed, right? And so I was
Wow.
trying to make this game that would be, now you would think of as a modern day like minis skirmish game mashup, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And so I got into, transition from RPGs into board games. And one of the first games I played was A Few Acres of Snow. Now,
Oh.
anybody that knows A Few Acres of Snow knows that it was the first sort of hybrid Euro war game that used deck building in an interesting way. And so it
Yes.
blew my mind, and it just like, wow, what just happened here? What is this thing? And so most people, when their first deck builder is Dominion, my first deck builder is A Few Acres of Snow, right?
How
So it's a very
cool. How
different place
cool.
to come into the genre.
Sure.
So I was getting into to board games. I'd seen A Few Acres of Snow. So about that time, my grandfather had passed away. And my
Oh.
grandfather fought in World War II.
Oh,
Um,
sorry to hear that.
yeah, no, thank you. But
Yeah.
he had fought in World War II, and I had a great relationship with him, but I had never really talked to him about that experience, right? And wasn't something we talked about.
Mm.
Also, about the same time, I was moving from the U.S. to the U.K., and I was living in Cambridge, and just a couple of months after moving there, my wife and I visited Normandy. We took our kids there. We visited Normandy, and I'm standing on the beach and I'm thinking, like, it was the most, like, one of the most like sort of momentous,
Yeah.
moving experiences of my life, right? I remember
Yeah.
my son was about 4 or 5 months old. I'm holding him on Omaha Beach where my grandfather was, and I was like, this is incredible. You know,
Wow.
pulling back the curtain a little bit, you had provided me the questions right before we met, and I was reading through them, and so I couldn't remember all the details of when I first started working on Undaunted. It was back in September of 2014, and I went back and I looked at the dates, and this was uncanny. So like, I visited Omaha Beach and Normandy on September 1st, and I wrote the first email to my friends about the game on September 2nd. So like, when I say that it was inspired by my grandfather and his actions in World War II, like,
Wow.
I couldn't remember myself how direct that inspiration was.
Wow.
I went back and read that original email, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about this game. I wanted to be about my grandfather's unit in World War II. And it's going to have these sort of deck building elements that are going to kind of draw from some of what's in Few Acres of Snow, but I wanted to harken back to all of these sort of skirmish combat games that I had played, all of this stuff that was like the formative part of my gaming experience. It was
Yeah. Yeah.
all those different things sort of coming together was the inspiration.
Wow. 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 That's an incredible story. And
Yeah, it's
man,
a
that's
long.
yeah. No, I didn't even realize that's kind of where all the inspiration to create Undaunted Normandy came from. Really, really cool to hear that story. So how did you go from, I know this is like, you've co-designed this with Trevor Benjamin.
Mhm.
How did you get from this initial idea into a playable prototype? And kind of
Yeah.
when did you start working with Trevor on this?
So yeah, Trevor comes into play after I had sort of finished the original prototype. I actually after I'd even pitched it to a publisher, right? So it was a little bit later on down the road. Again, when I look back at the timeline, it was incredible. The original sort of conception I had was the very beginning of September, and I had a playable prototype a couple of days later. And so back
Wow.
in 2014, before we had things like Tabletop Simulator, there was a piece of software called Roll20.net, and I think people probably use it for RPGs still.
Okay.
But I don't think people use it for prototyping board games. But that's all I had, and
That's
I
what you
wanted to
knew.
play with my old game group from when I lived in Alabama. So I had just moved to the UK. I didn't know anybody, so I was taking advantage of that relationship I had with them. And so I built this Roll20.net sort of really low budget, version of the game just a couple of days later after I'd sent the original email to prototype and
Wow.
play with them. so that was the first like playable prototype, and it's interesting to go back and look at it because if you describe the game, it is exactly what I described. It's a platoon, level. You're taking the role of the platoon leader. It's got all the deck building stuff. So much of it is exactly how it was originally described, and then like that's maybe like 80% of the description still remains, but like the good parts of the game were all the parts that came through literally years of design and development and refinement and that kind of stuff. But it's interesting to see, so yeah, that very first prototyping was on Roll20. I played with my old, like I said, my old friends from Alabama. I also was doing a lot of print and play because there were two groups in the UK that I was playing with at the same time. And so I was taking advantage of that. One was a group of coworkers who were also gamers. When I moved to the UK, there was a design and playtest meetup that's part of the UK larger meetup group in Cambridge that had designers like Brett Gilbert and Matthew Dunstan. So like extremely prolific, extremely talented people. And Trevor, who, as you mentioned, he was part of that same group.
Okay.
And so we met there, and I took this game, and I was fortunate enough to play, the prototype with that group. And so, this was September, and Spiel was coming up in October. So I had 1 month to get this game from concept to pitchable state, and so that 1 month sort of I've got to do it now, or if it's not I'm not going to have that opportunity. And so I started making, calling making appointments with publishers saying, hey, you want to see this.
After a month.
Well, yeah,
wow.
yeah. So yeah, during that month. And so, yeah. And keep in mind, I had no idea what I was doing, right? Because I had never designed a published game before. And so, and in retrospect, what's amazing about that experience, that single month leading up to Spiel is, I took For What Remains, what was called Platoon Command at the time, which became Undaunted, and then Switch and Signal, right? And those are three games that all went unpublished, but I took them all to that Spiel with me. So I went from like no games at all to like being super fortunate. Now they all took many years, right? So many years to happen.
Sure.
Yeah, that was a cool experience.
So your first prototype was just in Roll20, and then you started kind of making a physical print and play version of the game.
Yep.
How much play testing did you do at the, in that month before you took the idea to Spiel and, show it off?
Yeah. So quite a bit. I was meeting, at least multiple times a week in those different groups. Now, what's probably good about the fact that I had no idea what I was doing was there was a lot of room for improvement in those times, right? So I was meeting with people and I was like, okay, that clearly didn't work. Quickly refine. So that was great. The bad part is I didn't really know what I was doing as a designer, right? And so I didn't know the kind of right questions to ask. I didn't know necessarily how to interact with my playtesters. And it's pretty amazing in retrospect that I was able to get anything out of it. And I would say, like, one piece of advice that I would give to people who are new designers, right? Experienced designers will have already discovered this from themselves. But if anybody is a new designer that's watching, as I mentioned, I was part of that Cambridge-based group. And I distinctly remember, I have a horrible memory. So the fact that I can remember this is really impressive. I distinctly remember playing with Brett Gilbert one time. It was just the two of us. We were each playing. We played it. And Brett took a lot of time. And Brett is just an amazing like mentor, designer, everything, right? He took a lot of time giving me a lot of really good feedback. And I was kind of defensive about it. Right. And I was like, oh, this is why I did this. This is why I did this. Da, 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 da. And I mean, I think I probably listened to him, but like reluctantly and maybe not as much as I should have. Right.
Gotcha.
And that was just a sign of immaturity. Right. I mean, clearly like, oh, this is my baby. You're telling me this doesn't work.
Yeah.
Da, da, da. I think a lot of it is just, being super fortunate to be in the position I was in, to have the resources I had available to me. And a lot of it is just luck that, I was able to make those changes because I definitely wasn't necessarily as mature as I could have been in that situation, right? But to answer your actual question, there was a lot of play testing, even though it was only a month, maybe 3, 4, 5 play tests a week probably going on.
Cool. Did you get interest after that first Spiel presentation?
Yeah, I was super lucky. I went back and looked at the publishers I pitched to. This is pretty interesting in retrospect. So I had pitched to UGG, which is a war game publisher primarily in Germany, who does a lot of like localizations. Stronghold Portal, Osprey, those are the publishers I pitched to. They were all interesting interactions, each for their own reasons. But Osprey was so at the time, Osprey's board game division was just getting started. And there was a guy there by the guy who started it, Duncan Malloy, who was just an amazing guy, right? So when I think of people who, like, I kind of think of myself and him kind of coming up through the industry at the same time because he was just starting that,
Cool.
that Osprey division while I was just becoming a designer. He showed interest. He showed a lot of interest. And it's pretty amazing when I look at the state the game was in at the time for him to show interest. Like he must have seen something in the game, right?
Yeah.
So that was really cool in retrospect. But yeah, he was super interested in it. But at the time, he was obviously standing up at board game division. And he said, "Hey, now this is October 2014." He said, "I'm interested in this. We might be able to get it published in 2016." And I was like, "Okay, well, I know no difference. That sounds great to me."
Yeah.
And so I left Spiel thinking, "Wow, this is amazing. This might work out." Now we wound up kind of just falling out of communication, right? And he was super busy, and one thing led to another, and it wound up just not happening, right?
Okay.
And so within a couple of months, a different publisher reached out to me, a war game publisher, and they wanted to sign it, and they actually did sign it. And so this, I don't know that this has ever been really discussed before, but it was actually signed by a different war game publisher for a couple of years, and that war game publisher just never published it.
Oh,
So after
okay.
a couple of years, the contract expired, and so I eventually went back. And Duncan had said in that intervening 2 years, he said, "Hey, I'm still interested in the game," and so I went back to Osprey, and they signed it. So
That's cool. So in that 2 years where you were signed with the other war game publisher, and the game never came out, like what was going on development wise with it?
really, that's where a ton of the work happens, and that's where I meet Trevor, right? So that's where I start working with Trevor on it. So it was early 2015, right? So like I said, Duncan had showed interest, but fortunately he had said, "Hey, this needs a lot of refinement," which I knew, right? Like
Yeah.
I knew this needed some work. Some of it was some of the core mechanisms, but at the time when I pitched it, there was no concept of scenarios, right? It was like, and there was really no concept of like asymmetric forces in the setup. Like you kind of had your own forces, you could build it however you wanted to,
Okay.
etc. Right? When coming out of that spiel, I said, "Okay, well, we need scenarios, we need asymmetric setups. I don't want to do this by myself." I knew Trevor from the Cambridge group. I really was impressed with him, but more importantly, like we got along really well, right?
Cool.
And so we had just met at the time, but now years later, like he's one of my best friends in the world,
That's
right?
awesome.
And so it's fantastic, and it's a good thing too because we spend a lot of virtual time together.
Between this and War Chest, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. Again, this is interesting. It was January 2015 when we started using Tabletop Simulator. So now what's funny is you have all these pandemic stories about people who discover Tabletop Simulator the last year and a half. And I'm like, oh, no. We were the original people.
Doing it before it was cool.
Before it was cool. You always hear the people like, "Oh, I liked that band before they were cool."
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
we were playing Tabletop Simulator before it was cool. So, but yeah, so we started using it then. We would meet at Cambridge during our typical meetup in person, probably once a week or once every couple of weeks. But we were meeting multiple times a week at night after the kids were in bed because we have kids about the same age on Tabletop Simulator doing all the scenario design. And so really there were two critical things that happened. Like my school of thought is much more like on the historical side, right? Like I was like, "Oh, well, we have to do this because this is how the platoon's structured. So it has to have these guys and it has to." And Trevor's like, "Okay, it needs to be a good game. right?
Yeah.
We got to refine this. We have to polish this. And so thankfully that happened. And so
Cool.
tons of like really spiky edge, case rules and stuff were polished down during this time period. So the rules just became way better. And then also, the scenario design, which I think a lot of people, that's what they like about Undaunted, right? Is all the scenarios feel very different and it's very unique, different situations. So, so all of that stuff took place over about the next year and a half.
Cool. And did you, just out of curiosity, the modular board setup, did that kind of come along with the, when you started designing the scenarios, or did you have the modular board set up before then?
Yeah, it was weird. The modular board actually was in the very first email. Like, hey, it's going to consist of these 25 tiles and they're going to be modular, da 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 da. It was strange though. Like I had that idea and I did use that during all the playtesting, but it was never a big part of the actual experience. Like you just kind of plopped them down and you did what you did. It wasn't that big of a deal. So they existed, but they didn't really matter substantively until we started working on the scenario design.
Awesome. This is such a cool story. I couldn't even imagine that this whole game unfolded this way. Like, this is really cool.
And I didn't even remember it myself until I was looking back to it yesterday. And I actually sent my original emails to Trevor yesterday. I was like, hey, you're not going to believe this. This is so funny, right? And so, yeah.
That's so cool.
Yep.
So when did you guys start kind of documenting rules? Like is that something you did early on in the process, or was it,
So, well, when I went to that spiel in October 2014, that was a forcing mechanism. I had to document them then, right? So that's when the first rules were written. Up until that point, for that period, that month or so, I was basically teaching it to the people who were playing it. And so I committed another cardinal sin of design. The game never had an unguided playtest, right? Like I never gave the game to somebody with a set of rules and said, play this game for yourself,
see how you
right?
Do. Yeah.
Which don't again, new designers, don't do that thing, right? Like don't make that mistake because, if a publisher had taken the game at Spiel and they went back, I need to be able to confirm like people can play it themselves without me sitting there teaching them, right? But yeah, so I had the first set of written rules were then, and I actually just looked at that rule set again, in preparation for this, and it's funny, like it still is relatively similar to the 4 years later final version that Trevor and I delivered to Osprey, like superficially. But what's super funny about looking at the very first set of rules that were ever written and the rules that we delivered to Osprey, here's our final set of design rules, are things like command cards, right? Which they're command cards. It makes sense. That's a word that means things to most people. Were originally called something ridiculous, like platoon and something, like very war gamey. like no normal human that would ever want to play with cards called that, right? Like it's
that's hilarious.
Just like thank God.
Man, it sounds like a lot of like streamlining went on.
Yes.
But man, it definitely shows.
It went from being a game to a good game.
Yeah. So. It's still impressive that you were able to knock the original version out in a month. That's still super impressive. So what were some of the biggest challenges you faced during the design and development phase?
I talked about this a little bit. I mean, for sure, some of the biggest challenges were I was designing this game as a first-time designer, right? So now some of the challenges I have now are much more easily overcome than some of the challenges I had then. Because, when you're putting the design in front of people, I was putting it in front of my gamer friends who we might be in the middle of a playtest and I see there's a problem. And then we all sit and we pontificate about the problem or maybe some of the side effects of the problem. And it was much more difficult then to understand this is the problem. And I don't necessarily need us to try to come to a consensus and help them, have them help me design the game. Right. It was, right. And so, that was definitely a big challenge, trying to grow and mature as a designer at the same time as designing the game on the fly. That was a big thing. Probably just maturing it as a designer, because I mentioned that interaction I had with Brett, that memorable experience where, he was giving me advice and I was like, not receiving it the way I should have been, right? So I think it was me growing, not just the game getting
Yeah,
better, right?
yeah, that totally makes sense. Did you have any aha moments? I mean, it sounds like you had quite a few, especially like when you started working with Trevor and,
Yeah.
bouncing ideas.
Yeah, I think Trevor was my aha moment, right? Like, I mean, that as cheesy as that sounds, like that's totally true because the game, the game basically was sort of went through like two different design evolutions, right? It went through that super fast 2014 in preparation for Spiel, surge, and then it went through this much more methodical like development almost more than the design phase that was a year and a half in the making, right? So yeah, working with Trevor was definitely, that was the key thing that made the game work.
Cool. And how are the art and graphic design decisions made? Because I'm telling you, I love the art on the cards, especially. I mean, the modular tiles look great, but the way that every soldier, like, there's a cohesiveness to the whole set of cards, but they all look a little different.
Yeah. Again, like I'm just so fortunate about this project. So, obviously we've talked a lot about me and Trevor, right?
Yes.
But and I mentioned Duncan, right? So Duncan was there. He signed the game. Not long after Duncan signed the game, we were introduced to Philip Hartelius. I hope I'm saying that right, Philip. I hope I don't butcher your last name. So he basically, so even though Duncan signed the game and he was the lead for Osprey for board games at the time, Philip basically led the project, right? And so one of his things was art direction, right? He was basically the project manager to include everything. And so I think if you look at like Osprey's catalog, one thing that is fairly routine about Osprey is like their art is pretty kick-ass, right?
Yes,
Like,
yes.
I mean, I'm biased, but like it's on point. I think that they were so dedicated to it, and also their willingness to spend the money on the budget to have like individual art for every single character is just mind blowing, right?
Yeah.
And so they were putting a lot of faith because I think at the time, by the time it was finally published in 2019 and they had signed it in like 2017, I only had like one or two games out and they weren't big games, right? Like they did okay, but they were not like, it wasn't like they thought that, hey, why did they believe in the game? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
right? But
yeah.
they did enough to put the money into it. And so the artist, Roland McDonald, is just unbelievable, like
good.
unbelievable.
So
and
good.
so, yeah, now what exactly was happening? Like how much of that was like their art direction versus Roland's initiative? I can't speak to that. But like when I saw the very first images, I was like, oh, this is awesome. Just so awesome. So awesome. And I'll tell you, like, this is really an aside to the question, but I was fortunate that they let us, because, when you're looking at the cards, every single soldier's not only individually depicted, but has their own name, right?
Yes, yes.
And so, it's such a small touch, and that was their touch. That was Duncan and Philip. One of them came up with that. That was not by me and Trevor's request. But it was an amazing touch that people have commented on constantly. So we had the opportunity to give them some names. So unlike my super historical games like Pavlov's House and stuff like that, where they're based on real people, these were fictitious names we came up with. And so some of them were just like play testers who we wanted to give credit to and stuff like that. But my grandfather's actually in the game, right? So which is amazing, right? Because that's
awesome.
what, I based the game.
What a cool tribute. Yeah.
I know, and he's the U.S. platoon sergeant, which a lot of people, when they're doing like a video review, they'll hold up that card, and I'm like, oh, that's my grandfather's card.
Oh, that's so cool. That's really special.
Yeah, and then this is a little bit bizarre. So after the game had totally been designed, they were like, we had signed it with them, and they were working on the art and stuff. My wife was visiting her family in Alabama, and she took out her family Bible and was like reading through the family Bible stuff and realized, oh, my grandfather was also in the same unit in World War II. Right. So, and I found that out in time enough. So her grandfather's actually got a card in the game too.
That's so cool. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
So all of those little, like, artistic little pieces to the game are just super meaningful and awesome.
Yeah. Does Roland, I know Roland did the art. Does he also do the graphic design? Or is that somebody else?
I think no, he doesn't do the graphic
Okay.
design, and I'm super embarrassed to say that I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they've used the same person
Okay.
for
Yeah.
the graphic design.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it's working.
yeah,
Whoever
yeah.
did it,
It's
it's
working.
working.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Very
yeah.
cool.
And I would be remiss because I've mentioned the rest of the team. Anthony Huego is he's like the other. He's come on since Duncan's left Osprey, and he's the one that sort of managed the Osprey brand alongside Philip, and just the team. It's like the most cohesive team I've worked with on any game. So it's like when people see me and Trevor's names, they credit us with the design, but Osprey has been just an amazing partner with it.
Awesome. And how did you come up with the name Undaunted Normandy? I mean, I obviously know why it's Normandy, but at the time that you kind of started working on this, did you always envision having more? Because now it's kind of turning into a bit of a series with like North Africa, and you have the new reinforcements, expansion. Yeah, so how did you come up with the name Undaunted?
Yeah, that's a good question. So originally it was going to be called Platoon Command. It was called Platoon Command up until the point we signed it with Osprey. And at some point, well, there was a couple of things. During that period between when I started designing it and when they signed it, a game had come out by a guy named Mark Walker called Platoon Commander.
Okay.
So there was already so this other game came out. We could have still called it that. I don't know how much of that drove it versus them wanting to come up with something that was just a little bit more like evocative and interesting than like Platoon Command, which isn't the most, inspiring name of all time. So I actually went back and looked this up because they had gone and they were debating some different options. And so I wanted to let you know what some of those early options were if you're interested.
Yes, please.
So the very first two they had sent us were Undaunted Normandy and Heat of Battle Normandy. Heat of Battle Normandy sounds like an old 1980s TV show, so I'm glad we didn't go with Heat of Battle Normandy. Then there was a second.
Can't unhear
there was
it
a
now.
second batch of potential names that were Undaunted Normandy, Vanguard Normandy, Courage Under Fire Normandy, and Fires of Normandy. And so I don't know. I think, and I don't remember. I don't have like all the details of exactly how we went back and forth. I think Trevor and I just kind of said, hey, we're whatever you all want to name the game, we're okay with.
Okay, cool.
And somehow, magically, thank goodness, we came up with Undaunted Normandy. Because in retrospect, it seems like the obvious choice, right? But, who knows? Like maybe if we called it Vanguard Normandy, we would have become used to that name. But yeah, so all of those were potential names, and it finally landed with Undaunted Normandy. Now, the sort of second question you asked is like, why does it have the colon, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is another sort of, amazing thing, and credit to Duncan's foresight and belief in the game. He actually commissioned Undaunted North Africa before Undaunted Normandy was ever even released.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it was very interesting. So we met at UK Games Expo of 2017. Mm-hmm. And I said, hey, that's when we met. And I said, hey, the game's no longer under contract with anybody. The contract expired. Are you still interested in it? And he was. And then a few months later at Spiel, that's when he said, okay, yeah, we want to officially sign it. And not only do we want to officially sign it, but we want to go ahead and commission a sequel.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, that's mind-blowingly awesome.
Totally.
During that, yeah. And so, I mean, here's the funny thing that most people don't know. Trevor and I actually finished the design for Undaunted North Africa before Undaunted Normandy was ever even released. Right? So, like,
holy cow!
Yeah.
Oh my goodness! Yep. Wow. I mean,
it's crazy.
Yeah, I guess it came out. So Normandy came out in 2019, and then
the summer of 2019,
and then 2020 was North Africa. I guess that makes sense, but that's crazy.
Yeah, I will say this. Osprey is a fine-oiled machine, and they keep us on schedule. So if they want a game to release in a couple of years, they want to have like 18 months ahead of time from us.
Okay.
So,
cool.
Yeah, they're serious.
Yeah, I was gonna also ask, like, when it came to Normandy, when did you know it was finished? Was it just that did Osprey have a deadline or?
Yes, the answer to your question is actually Osprey had a deadline we had to meet, and I think it was like April 2018. So like over a year before it was released was when we had to deliver everything.
Okay.
Now, that gave them time to do some like development work on it too, right? Because that's factored into the schedule. But really, we had been working on it so much up until that point that it was just at that point just kind of going through refinement with them, right? It wasn't one of those like we were fortunate that we weren't like racing against the clock trying to fix things last second once they said they wanted it.
Yeah. Oh, cool. And can you touch on just briefly like the new expansion reinforcements? Kind of like what the design process or, what does that add to the mix here?
Yeah. So for people that aren't familiar with the series, you've got like Undaunted Normandy, which is the first standalone game. And then you had Undaunted North Africa, which was a sequel, but it's a standalone thing. So it's not an expansion, right? And so it adds a lot of what people wanted from Normandy, coming out of Normandy. They wanted two things. They wanted a solo game, and they wanted a lot more asymmetry in the forces,
and
right?
Jeeps,
and we thought, and Jeeps, that's right. That's right. And we thought, we thought in Normandy, like even though the decks, like if you look at the entirety of the deck, it's symmetrical. We thought because what you're playing in every scenario is asymmetric, like that would scratch that asymmetric itch, and also what you're trying to achieve and stuff. All of that's asymmetric. But people wanted like, no, I want to have my own toys that nobody else can have. I want that level of asymmetry. And so we gave the two of them in North Africa, right, in spades, like very, very different play experiences for the two sides.
For sure.
But what we didn't realize is, oh boy, the solitaire community is super interested in Undaunted, like super interested. There's a lot of fan-made versions. I'm going to maybe butcher this, like the Board Game Geek, I think the One Player Guild, which is a super big guild, I think maybe the biggest guild, it won like the best solo game that's not a solo game of the year, something like whatever that is, right? So like clearly there's interest. And so Reinforcements gives them what they want. It gives them a solo game, right? And so now this is not designed by Trevor and me. This was designed by David Turksey and David Digby.
Okay.
Just like everything that Osprey does, it can't just be like, hey, let's just have a basic solo game for the new scenarios. No, it's this solo system allows you to play every single scenario from Normandy, every single scenario from Africa, all the new 8 scenarios that are in Reinforcements from the perspective of both sides. Right.
So cool.
So when you add that up, it's like, I don't know, 60 something different possible solo experiences, right? So you get your solo play.
So you gave the people what they wanted. Yeah,
we gave the people what they wanted.
Man, I have Reinforcements on pre-order right now, so I can't wait to check it out.
Yeah. Now the other thing that my favorite thing in gaming is team-based games, right? So I want to play anytime I'm given the opportunity. Give me a game like Birth of America games or the Quartermaster General, anything that give me on a team.
Yeah,
that's what I want to do.
So fun.
And so there's a team-based, it introduces team play. And so it's 2v2. You can play that way in all the new 8 scenarios. So there's 8 new scenarios, 4 for Normandy, 4 for North Africa. There's also new units and new stuff like that too. Cool. But yeah, it introduces team play, which is my favorite way to play the game now. So
that's awesome. Yeah, my friend that I'm playing Normandy campaign with right now, we also, with our significant others, play War Chest, and we love doing team War Chest.
Yeah, I love team War Chest. That's again my favorite way to play for sure.
Cool. So do you have any advice? Like I know you're kind of at this point known for making these hybrid war game Euros. Do you have any advice for somebody who maybe is going to try to design a hybrid game?
It's like games in general have become more and more hybrid, right? Just in general, right? There's not that many examples now where like, oh, that is an extreme Euro, like super dry Euro, or that's, there are still hex and counter war games. But like, I would say that first, never believe that like the heavy simulationist or like, complexity that people often ascribe to trying to be historically accurate in a war game. Like those things are not like all necessarily tied together, right? It doesn't, if you want your game to be like historically accurate or lean into history, it doesn't mean that it has to be like the super simulationist, very complex game, right? You can have your cake and eat it too. So those things are not necessarily inherently tied. Undaunted is definitely let's err on the side of gameplay, right, more than historicity, for sure, right? Even though the scenarios, like, they were inspired by actual battles. Like, so I visited every scenario that's in Undaunted Normandy. Like, I visited those battlegrounds, I visited those places, and I researched them. But it's for the inspiration, right? It's not, I didn't model those scenarios, but like Castle Litter or Pavlov's house, those are very, very, I'm very much trying to model that experience, and so I'm trying to deliver that historical experience to the player. So try to figure out where on that spectrum you want your game to fall, and let that drive the sort of design intent. And then I would just say, like, borrow from both sides, because what you'll hear, there's a very common thought that's going on, especially on the wargaming side, where you'll hear like, oh, there's a lot of introduction of Euro mechanisms into wargame. And I'm like, well, it's a two-way street, right? And so I would encourage designers, like, one of my favorite mechanisms in the world is chit pull, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of similarities between chit pull and bag building and deck building, but there's some differences. There's some important differences. And I would love to see something as cool as chit pull, where you get the integration of like activation and initiative and like your turn management in more Euros, right?
Yeah.
And so borrow liberally, mix them together. Yeah.
That is a great idea. Cool. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much, David. Thanks for, sharing the whole backstory of Undaunted Normandy and just the Undaunted series in general. I would have never imagined that that's how it started, or that this was like, you were such a fresh designer at the time that, you came up with the concept for this game. And yeah, your partnership with Trevor just kind of, made everything skyrocket. It's a really great story.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This has been awesome.
Cool,
I've enjoyed it.
Cool. Yeah, I know. It's been great talking to you. And I know, I kind of mentioned War Chest is another game that you've worked on with Trevor, and you have the Nobility expansion, then the new Siege expansion, which I've yet to try, but it's on my shelf. I'm a big fan of War Chest. I think I played Undaunted Normandy first and was like, who are these two guys? And then I just started and then I was like, what is this War Chest game? And I got it and I love it. So whatever kind of formula you two have together, it's really working for me especially. But beyond that, I know you have your Valiant Defense series with Dan Versen Games, and you're doing lots of solo games, Pavlov House, Castle Itter, and your newest one, Soldiers in Postmen's Uniforms. So they are on my shelf. I cannot wait to check them out when I get some me solo time happening. But yeah, thank you again so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for watching Cardboard Creations. Hopefully it's been as inspiring and fascinating for you as it has been for me. And remember, the only way to get something done is to start doing it.